You're probably familiar with the term uncanny valley. It was first coined by the roboticist Masahiro Mori in the 70s. He described how the more human you try to make a robot look, the more it elicits a feeling of unease or revulsion in the observer. Our brains are finely tuned to recognize human faces and expressions, so when a person looks almost human but has subtle deviations, possibly even deviations that we can't consciously identify, it creates this cognitive dissonance and an uncomfortable feeling. The question is, why have we developed this sense? Why have we evolved to recognise when a human face isn't human? That's the subject of today's video. Meetings with people who seem subtly inhuman. One of the eeriest examples of uncanny people is what has become known as the mirror men phenomena. I first heard about this on the Monsters Among Us podcast and the Beyond Creepy YouTube channel. This post by somebody called BD is a good example of a typical mirror man encounter. BD was doing a training session in the middle of the night in the woods of Southern California. Their group had split into pairs, each navigating through the dark forest. These men were well trained, they knew how the dark could play tricks on their eyes, so they weren't prone to letting their imagination get the better of them. At around 2 a.m, BD's group was struggling to find their final checkpoint. They'd been told that they had to stay in the forest, but in order to get a better look at their map, they walked out onto a road where the light was better. They then spotted 3 figures coming down the road towards them. At first they assumed it was their instructors, and they quickly hid in the shadows, watching as the figures walked past. As they got closer, they got a very uneasy feeling from the figures. It was dark, so they couldn't make out any definite features on the people walking down the road, but they could see that each figure was of an identical height and build. Each one was very tall, being about 6'7". They also seemed to be muttering in an unknown language. Most unusual of all though, all 3 figures were walking in total unison. Each step of their feet and swing of their arms matched the other man perfectly. BD found the sight extremely unsettling. Once the figures had left, they continued on their way, and they eventually found their final checkpoint. They asked around to see if anybody knew about the very tall people that they'd seen, but nobody seemed to know anything about them. Later, 2 other participants returned to the checkpoint, and they reported the same thing. They had seen 3 men walking in perfect synchronization, which also made them feel very uneasy. This is typical of most mirror men sightings. According to reports, they most often appear as 3 identical looking men. Usually they're dressed in identical old-fashioned looking suits, and they appear to be walking in perfect unison. It's described as if looking into a mirror. Some people have reported feeling dizzy and even blacking out as the men get closer. There's a report from 1993 or 94. It describes an event where a group of teenage girls were driving around their small hometown in southern Utah when they saw a very strange sight whilst they were stopped at the lights. A group of 6 men crossed the road in front of the car. These men were all the same height and build. They were all wearing the same clothes, and they all moved in perfect unison, as if their movements were choreographed. The girls naturally got a very creepy feeling from the men, but their curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to follow the men to see where they were going. After the men crossed the road, they turned and walked down the sidewalk. At this point, the girls pulled up alongside them, rolled down their windows, and started shouting and calling to the men, trying to get their attention. The men continued to walk, completely synchronized, down the road. They gave no outward indication that they were aware of the girls' presence at all. The girls continued to follow the men, their shouts getting louder and louder, until suddenly all 6 men stopped and their heads snapped towards the car, still in perfect unison, and all at once they shouted, "Go away." It was then that the girls noticed that all 6 men had completely identical faces. This freaked them out even more, and they quickly sped away in the car, but as they got to the end of the street, once again their curiosity got the better of their preservation instincts, and they decided to turn around and go back to pester the men once more. The strange thing is, by the time they'd turned the car around, the men had vanished, seemingly into thin air. I've got no idea what to make of these sightings. It could just be people playing a prank, maybe it's some kind of performance art piece, but consistent among the reports is this very uncanny feeling that the experiencer gets when seeing the mirror men. There are a lot of these reports, and I'm sure quite a high number of them are completely fake. People hearing about the mirror men and deciding to make up their own creepypasta style story about them. I'm sure that happens, but the sheer volume of these encounters and the consistency between the reports makes it hard to dismiss them entirely. So, I don't know, could there be some truth to the mirror man phenomena? And if so, who are they? Another type of uncanny human encounter is one where somebody meets a person and they appear to be wearing a sort of disguise or just acting oddly, as if unaccustomed to regular human interaction. This one I found in a book called Extraordinary Encounters by Jerome Clark. On May the 15th in 1970, in St. Louis, USA, a woman named Dorothy Simpson was working as a desk clerk in a motel. It was around 10:30 a.m. and Dorothy was looking over some documents on the desk. She heard a strange sound which she described as a whistling sigh. When she looked up, there was a very odd-looking family standing on the other side of the desk. There were 2 adults, a man and a woman, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. All members of the family were extremely short, barely reaching the top of the desk. The adults were barely taller than the children. They were dressed in expensive-looking clothes. The 2 males wore tailored suits, and the females wore peach-coloured dresses. They all had a youthful appearance and unusual faces. Wide at eye level, their faces thinned abruptly to their chins. The eyes were large, dark, and slightly slanted. Their noses had practically no bridges, and 2 slits for nostrils. Their mouths were tiny and lipless, no wider than the nostrils, and they had extremely pale skin. Simpson also suspected that they were all wearing wigs, as their hair had an artificial look to it. The man of the group asked in a high-pitched voice, "Do you have a room to stay? Do you have a room to stay?" When Simpson explained the price of the room, he appeared not to understand. He stood there awkwardly in silence for a long time before pulling a large wad of money out of his pocket. This pile of money was so clean and crisp that Simpson wondered if it was counterfeit. Even so, she took 2 $20 bills from him and asked him his name so that she could put it into the reservation form. The man told her his name was A. Bell. Dorothy Simpson then asked him where he'd come from. The man pointed up to the ceiling and he said, "We come from up there, up there." At this, the woman who was with him pushed down his arm and then told Simpson that they were from Hammond, Indiana, and she provided a street address. A later investigation would reveal that this address was fake. The man then signed the register, but Simpson noted that he held the pen awkwardly, as if he'd never used one before. The woman then asked where they could eat, and Dorothy Simpson directed them to the motel's restaurant. The waitress who served this family in the restaurant also found them very peculiar. The man kept asking strange questions, things about the ingredients on the menu and where they'd come from. Eventually they ordered, but their order was also very strange. The woman and the 2 children just had a bowl of peas each and a glass of milk. The man ordered a steak with peas and a glass of water. They seemed to have a lot of trouble eating this meal. They couldn't fit most of the food into their tiny mouths. Each one would pick up a single pea on a knife, bring it up to their mouths and suck it in through the tiny slit. The man was completely unable to eat any of the steak. When they were done with their meal, they handed the waitress a $20 bill. When she came back with their change, they'd left the table. At this point, a bellhop was showing them to their room. The family appeared to be terrified of the lift doors, and it was as if they'd never encountered an elevator before, and he had to assure them that it was perfectly safe before they would enter. When he showed them to their room, he tried to turn on the light, but the man shouted at him, telling him that the light would hurt the children's eyes. At this, the bellhop retreated and returned to his station. Every member of staff that had interacted with this family remarked on how unusual they were. At the start of their shifts the following morning, they waited for the family to come downstairs, eager to see them leave, but this family never appeared. When they checked the room, it was empty, but no other member of staff had seen them leave, and after this, they were seemingly never seen again. Five members of staff were later interviewed by John Shrouded, and they all confirmed the story. Shrouded was a UFO researcher, which suggests that he at least believed that the family may have been aliens of some sort. I do wonder if this was just a family with some kind of rare genetic condition. There are a number of syndromes that can cause similar facial characteristics to the ones described, so it could be, I suppose. But then there's the odd behaviour, seeming to be unfamiliar with basic things like lift doors and how to use a pen. It adds an extra element of intrigue to the case. A Reddit user called Shugazi describes a similar encounter. In Charleston, South Carolina, around Christmas 2007, Shugazi was working as a barista inside a big retail store when two highly unusual people came in. These people were pale Caucasian women in their mid-20s. They were strikingly similar in appearance, except one was a head taller than the other. They both had straight platinum blonde bowl cuts which framed their round, identical faces. Their eyes were bright hazel coloured and they were larger than usual, giving them an intense gaze. Their skin was seemingly flawless, devoid of any blemishes, scars, or even visible pores. It was reminiscent of an Instagram filter. They moved around with a very stiff gait, as if they had boards strapped to their backs. They were wearing oversized sweaters, and one of them was wearing their sweater backwards with the tag hanging out the front. Their behaviour was extremely bizarre. The shorter woman looked around the store with a childlike curiosity, as if she'd never seen a store before. When a member of staff greeted them, the smaller woman looked to the taller one for approval before attempting an awkward wave which was very robotic, like a windshield wiper motion. They wandered around the cafe, examining cups and French presses. The shorter one often pointed and asked questions in a language that was described as sounding like a mix of Simlish and baby babble. After about 10 minutes, the shorter woman picked out a cup and brought it to the counter. She was frequently looking to the taller woman for reassurance. She also attempted a peculiar smile that was more like baring her teeth. When it was time to pay, she pulled out a strange silver credit card. The card was completely blank, no name or numbers on it, just a bare card with a chip on it. The taller woman had to step in to complete the transaction, treating it as if it was a teaching moment. They then both shuffled out of the cafe and into the store, and the barista never saw them again. Beneath the post, Shugazi provided a photoshopped image that they'd found online. They say that this image is very, very similar to the people that they saw in the coffee shop. There is a suggestion with a lot of these stories that there's something paranormal about these encounters. It seems to depend on what the experiencer's personal beliefs are, on what they attribute this paranormal phenomena to. Most of the time it seems to be aliens, but I've read reports from people who've come away from these encounters believing that they've met an angel or a demon or a fairy or a vampire. Now, I'm not here to dismiss their beliefs or to confirm them. I'm just saying there does seem to be people out there who, when interacted with, give the impression that they're not quite human. I worked in retail for years, and I've got to say, you do encounter all kinds of different people. Those with neurological or psychological disorders that make them act very strangely. I don't think I've ever met someone who I thought wasn't human, but I definitely see how some people could give that impression. One of the most common reports I found whilst researching this video was people who didn't look or act strangely, but they just gave off a vibe, a cold feeling of dread, usually when making eye contact with someone. For example, from No Strayway Denied on Reddit. I worked as a cashier in a grocery store when I was in high school. Once a woman came through, perfectly normal, well dressed. She bought a few things, and when she gave me the payment, I turned around to put it in a drawer and then turned back around with her receipt and change. I told her to have a nice day or whatever, and even though it wasn't the first time we'd made eye contact, the best way I can describe it is it was like she'd pulled up a shutter in her eyes and there was just pure evil. Her face was still pleasant, but her eyes weren't human anymore. She saw my face and then she smiled. She knew that she'd scared the hell out of me and she was amused. It was like she'd done it on purpose and it gave her a thrill. I felt like I was frozen, and then when she blinked, her eyes were just normal again and she nodded at me and walked away smiling. I immediately turned off the light on my check lane and went up to the customer service to tell them I needed a break. They let me because I'd never done that before, and probably because I looked weird. I sat in the smoking break room and shook. I told one of my co-workers about it when I got back and asked if he noticed her or anything weird, but he hadn't. In the same thread, Alex989 says, working in food service for several years has led me to come across a lot of people that unnerved me. Most just seemed like empty vessels. I remember working by myself about 5 years ago when a man came in to pick up his order. It was just me and him, and nothing initially seemed off about his physical appearance or his words. When I looked into his eyes, I felt dread, like I was staring into a dark void. He was acting pleasant, but he seemed like he could murder someone and still maintain the soft expression on his face. I felt like I knew something about him that I shouldn't. I actually experienced something like this myself when I was a kid. I have told this story before in the previous video, but it was a long time ago, so I'm going to tell it again. Where I grew up in North Wales, there was this quite grotty looking independent cinema that showed mostly old kids movies. Although you couldn't see the recent releases, it was really cheap, so we went there quite often. One time, me, my dad and my brother went. We were watching a film and I got up to use the toilet. The way this cinema was laid out was that only the balcony seats were open. Here's a photo of the owners of the cinema sitting in those very same balcony seats. The cinema was so deserted that almost all the other seats in the cinema weren't used. It was only the balcony that was ever open when we went, and half the time it was only ever us in there. So if you wanted to go to the toilet, you had to leave the balcony, go down the stairs, and then go into this dark corridor that ran under the balcony. It was pretty isolated down there. So I went in, used the toilet, and as I was coming out and walked back into the corridor, the owner of the cinema was just standing there, blocking my path. He wasn't doing anything, he was just standing motionless outside the toilets, and it felt as if he was waiting for me to come out. I looked up at him, into his eyes, and he gave me this cold, dead stare that made me feel like I was completely rooted to the spot. I don't really know how to explain it other than, you know how some animals freeze up when they're in danger, like a rabbit when a predator's about to get them. That's how I imagine it must feel. There was this evil vibe coming off the guy, and for a moment I got a feeling that was like, this guy is going to kill me right now. He stands there staring at me for quite a while, just not saying anything. And then all of a sudden my flight or fight response kicks in and I push past him and run up the corridor back to my seat. I never said a word about it to my dad. I just finished watching the movie and then we left. So yeah, a pretty weird experience, but here's where it gets creepy. A few years later, that guy who'd stopped me in the corridor would be arrested for the murder and mutilation of 4 men. Look him up, the guy's name is Peter Moore. He was also known as the Man in Black. He would cruise around the local cottage sites in North Wales and he committed numerous assaults on men and 4 murders. This experience makes me wonder, when people describe this feeling of an unexplainable dread when looking into the eyes of certain people, could they be encountering psychopaths or undiscovered serial killers? Anyway, I know this video is meandering all over the place. I thought I would finish off with 2 other Reddit stories that I found. They creeped me out, but they didn't seem to fit in with any of the other cases that I've covered already, so I'll stick them in at the end here. Make of them what you will. Regular Human 6969 posted, last year, me and my boyfriend went to Portland to see Tenacious D in concert. We got a hotel room and stayed a few nights. The night before the concert, we decided to go on a walk to a local pizza joint to get some dinner. When we arrived there was a line of 5 to 6 people in front of us. We were waiting our turn and we were just listening to the other people's conversations around us. It was packed due to the Pride Festival being held that weekend. We both started noticing that the conversations of the people around us were odd. Some seemed to be speaking in what sounded like Simlish. Others seemed to be having conversations that were just nonsense, like they were just saying random words. My boyfriend and I looked at each other really confused. I got scared and asked my boyfriend if we could leave, and he quickly agreed. On the walk back to the hotel, we talked about what had just happened. We joked about how they must be NPCs or aliens, but it honestly freaked us both out a lot. We ordered in that night and didn't leave the hotel for the rest of the night. Finally, a post by Lola Loopy Lou, which I'm not going to read in full, but I'll summarise it. Lola was driving from Leeds to Scotland when, about an hour into the journey, they saw a hitchhiker on the side of the road. The man was wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase and was, according to Lola, very handsome. She decided to pull over and give him a lift. On the way they chatted a little bit about hobbies and stuff, but the guy mostly stayed pretty quiet. After a couple of hours they stopped at a village pub and got food. When they were done with their meal at about 11 PM, they got back into the car. At this point, the hitchhiker started making advances towards Lola, and then they end up having sex right there in the pub car park. When they were done, Lola asks the man if he's ready to head off, and he suddenly jumps out of the car and runs off into a pitch black forest which was next to the pub. Lola sits there wondering what the hell's just happened. She waits around 10 minutes for him to come back, but he never returns, so she just drives off alone, continuing her journey. It's a pretty weird encounter so far, but it gets even stranger when Lola arrives at Glasgow and checks the boot of her car. She sees that the hitchhiker has left his briefcase in there. She looks inside the briefcase and finds some clothes, a packet of Maltesers, and an envelope with Lola's full name written on it. This really freaks out Lola because she never told the hitchhiker her full name. She had never seen him go into the suitcase or write anything down the whole time she'd been with him. Inside the envelope was £250 in £50 notes and a letter which said, "Buy something pretty." So had Lola met some kind of weird stalker, or as surmised by the title of the post, had she actually had sex with an alien? Anyway, that's the end of the video. I know it's been a bit of a weird one, just a jumble of stories that I found interesting, but I like doing these kind of videos from time to time just to break it up. Thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons for helping keep the lights on. I post ad-free versions of my videos then 24 hours before they go live on YouTube, and sometimes I put uncut versions up when I have to remove certain images to make them YouTube safe. So if you want to support the channel, check out my Patreon. Alternatively, you could just drop a like or a comment on the video, that really helps me out as well. Anyway, catch you in the next video. Until next time, goodbye.